Hey all, today I will be talking about Abraham Lincoln. I'm focusing on his paternal line for now, as well as his descendants. I usually wouldn't focus on descendants at all, but spoiler alert, there aren't many. So it shouldn't take too much time. After discussing his descendants, I'll swing around and move through his paternal line. His maternal line is interesting and somewhat controversial, and will probably take a lot of time to discuss. But I am currently making a separate video for this as we speak, which I plan to release in the next week or two. So, as many of you know, Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky. He was a congressman before becoming 16th President of the United States in 1860. His election triggered the Civil War, which led to the emancipation of the slaves. Of course, he was reelected in 1864 before being assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in the Ford Theater in 1865. His wife, Mary Ann Todd, who lived from 1818 to 1882. Together they had 4 children, all sons: Robert Todd Lincoln, Edward Baker Lincoln, William Wallace Lincoln, and Thomas Lincoln. Only Robert Todd Lincoln got married and had children. He had 3 children with Mary Harlan. He served as Secretary of War under Presidents James A. Garfield and Chester A. Arthur from 1881 to 1885. At one point, he was pushed heavily by the Republican Party to run for president. He turned this down. Anyway, his 3 children were Mary Lincoln, 1869 to 1938, Abraham Lincoln, 1873 to 1890, and Jessie Harlan Lincoln, 1875 to 1948. As you can see, this Abraham Lincoln's death resulted in the end of the male Lincoln line from President Abraham Lincoln, and even, as we'll see later, Abraham's father, Thomas Lincoln. Mary Todd Lincoln married Charles Bradford Isham. They had 1 son named Lincoln Isham, who had no children. Jessie Harlan Lincoln married Warren Wallace Beckwith and had 2 children, Mary Lincoln Beckwith and Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, neither of whom had children, thus ending the line of President Abraham Lincoln, unless, of course, somebody was doing something that we don't know about. So Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith was the final descendant of Abraham Lincoln. Anyway, getting back to the president, Abraham was the second of 3 children born to Thomas Lincoln, 1778 to 1851, Thomas Lincoln, and Nancy Hanks. As I said, I'm just focusing on the Lincoln paternal line for now. I will definitely address the family of Nancy Hanks in the near future. Anyway, Thomas and Nancy Hanks had 3 children. Along with Abe, there was also Sarah Lincoln and Thomas Lincoln Jr., who died in infancy. Nancy Hanks died in childbirth along with their 4th child in 1818. Sarah Lincoln also died in childbirth when she was having her child with Aaron Grigsby, who was named George Grigsby, but both Sarah and George died during the childbirth of George. Therefore, Abe was the only living child of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln to have surviving offspring. Thomas was a farmer and carpenter who had a tumultuous relationship with his famous son. He was born to Abraham Lincoln and Bathsheba Herring. He was the 4th of 5 children born. The others were Mordecai, Josiah, Mary, and Nancy. Abraham Lincoln, who was born in 1744 and died in 1786, was born in Pennsylvania. He was a pioneer settler of Kentucky and a military captain during the American Revolution. Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed by Native Americans while working in the field in his home with his sons, Mordecai, Josiah, and Thomas. Josiah ran to the aid station. Thomas stood shocked by his father. The Native American reached for Thomas and was shot dead by 15-year-old Mordecai. President Abraham Lincoln had a much better relationship with Mordecai than his father, once stating that Mordecai ran off with all the talent in the family. So just think about that. If Mordecai never shot that Native American, then Thomas Lincoln may have been killed and President Lincoln would never have been born. Pretty crazy to think about that. Anyway, Captain Abraham Lincoln's parents were John Lincoln and Rebecca Flowers. Abraham was the oldest of their 9 children. John Lincoln lived from 1716 to 1788. He was a weaver by trade and worked on the colonial frontier alongside farmers. He was born in New Jersey and died in Pennsylvania. John Lincoln was the oldest child of Mordecai Lincoln II and his first wife, Hannah Salter. John Lincoln was Mordecai's only son from his first wife, though Mordecai did have several more sons with his second wife. Mordecai was a yeoman by trade. He was born in 1686 and died in 1736. Mordecai built a house in 1733 in Pennsylvania that exists to this day. I have a picture right here. It currently stands in Berks County, Pennsylvania. It was used as a farmhouse for hundreds of years before being abandoned and then restored to its 1730s form in the 1980s. It was listed as a Pennsylvania historic marker at that time. So this Mordecai Lincoln had a younger brother also named Abraham who followed him from his place of birth of Massachusetts to Pennsylvania. So I included this just because it's a good example of kind of the recurrent names that happen so often in these different families. Well, Mordecai Lincoln II's parents were Mordecai Lincoln I and Sarah Jones. Mordecai I was born in 1657 and died in 1727. He lived his entire life in Massachusetts. Interestingly, this Mordecai Lincoln also built a home that still stands today. It was originally built in 1691 in Scituate, Massachusetts. It's not, obviously has not been restored in the same way that his son's house was, but it's still in pretty good shape today. It is currently historically preserved by the state. Okay, and Mordecai Lincoln I was born to Samuel Lincoln and his wife Martha Lyford. So Samuel Lincoln was born in Hingham, England in 1622 and died in Hingham, Massachusetts in 1690. So here's a photo of that location on a map. Let me just bring that up for you here. So as you can see here, this is where Hingham is, eastern England. Swanton Morley, which is another family location of the Lincolns. They originated in Swanton Morley and then moved to Hingham. So I included that on the map as well. So Samuel emigrated to the U.S. as a servant and eventually met up with his older brother Thomas, who was a weaver and already living in the U.S. Thomas was one of the original settlers of Hingham, Massachusetts, and was given a house by the town. He also amassed a considerable amount of money. Thomas died without children and passed all of his wealth to Samuel. This house still exists today in Hingham, Massachusetts, and is considered to be a historical landmark. So another of Samuel Lincoln's children Samuel Lincoln Jr., was the ancestor of Levi Lincoln Sr. I will bring up here in just a minute. So Levi Lincoln Sr. was the Attorney General for Thomas Jefferson. And then Levi Lincoln Sr. was the father of Levi Lincoln Jr. and Enoch Lincoln, both of whom were prominent Massachusetts politicians in the 1800s. Anyway, Samuel Lincoln Sr. was the son of Edward Thomas Lincoln and Bridget Gilman. Edward Thomas Lincoln was born in Swanton Morley, Norfolk, England in 1580 and died in 1639 in Hingham, Norfolk, England. He came from a prominent local family and was born into money, but was disinherited after falling out with his father. This sank the family into poverty, which ultimately was the impetus for his sons Thomas and Samuel, previously mentioned, to come to the U.S. Edward Thomas Lincoln's father was Richard Lincoln, and mother was Elizabeth Remshing. Richard Lincoln, who lived from 1550 to 1620, was born in Swanton Morley, Norfolk, England, and died in Hingham, England. He was well off after he inherited a large house, among other things, from his father. This house still stands today and is currently a pub. So that's fun, and you can see it here in this little thumbnail. Richard's parents were Robert Lincoln Jr. and Margaret Appleby. So Robert Lincoln Jr. lived from 1525 to 1556. Not much is known about him, aside from the fact that he left Richard, his oldest son, the majority of his possessions, including land and a house. This was customary at the time. Oftentimes the oldest son inherited everything and everyone else had to fend for themselves. This was described in his will, which still exists today. It's possible that he, Robert Lincoln Jr., also had a younger son named John Lincoln. John Lincoln was the paternal ancestor of another American patriot, a major general during the American Revolution, named Benjamin Lincoln, actually Benjamin Lincoln IV, while most sources that I've found state that there is no connection between Abraham Lincoln and Benjamin Lincoln. I think that there is circumstantial evidence for a distant familial link. John's grandson, another Thomas Lincoln, which I'll show in just a minute, was born in Swanton Morley and also emigrated in the 1600s to Hingham, Massachusetts. There are several generations before we get to Benjamin Lincoln IV. I'll show you right here. So there he is. Typically, in my experience, people with the same surnames who lived in the same places and had similar migration patterns were typically related. There really weren't a whole lot of people even alive back then, so a familial relationship is pretty likely, even though no physical evidence has been found of this relationship. Anyway, getting back to Robert Lincoln Jr., sorry. His parents were Robert Lincoln Sr. and Joan Cowper. Robert Sr. lived from around 1496 to around 1543. His will also still exists, and he left his property to Robert Jr., his oldest son. So this Robert Sr. was President Abraham Lincoln's 8th great-grandfather and the earliest known paternal ancestor of Abraham Lincoln. So there you have it. This is Abraham Lincoln's paternal family. I will explore his mother's family in a future video. As I mentioned previously, Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks, comes from a far more controversial background that is still subject to debate today. I will be making a video about her line in the very near future, so stay tuned for that. And of course, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you have any recommendations, I'd love to hear them. Until next time, take care.